Hi, my name is Gabe Ignetti, and I'm here to talk to you about a quite controversial subject, nuclear power. So you may ask, what motivated me to be here talking to you about this? It's really very simple. Just like you, I'm concerned about our fossil fuel addiction, and I want to do my part to drive a stake right through the heart of the fossil fuel industry. And nuclear is simply the best way to do it. Now, nuclear power has had a problem. Since the day of its inception, it looked like this, and ever since, people have confused it with that. And it often seems that any time I speak about this subject, the reaction is this. So let me begin by unpacking some urban myths. First, nuclear reactors cannot do this. It's physically impossible. And living next to a nuclear power plant for 1 year will give you less radiation exposure than eating a banana. In fact, out of all the energy sources, nuclear is the safest according to all the accepted worldwide fatality data. And nuclear saves lives. 1.8 million lives have been saved from air pollution, and an additional 7 million lives could be saved in the next 4 decades by replacing fossil fuels with atomic energy. But there is one thing that nuclear power is not safe for, and that is the fossil fuel industry. When the old Sierra Club came out strongly for nuclear power, the chief executive officer of Atlantic Richfield Petroleum responded by facilitating the breakaway of the anti-nuclear Friends of the Earth with the help of a $500,000 donation. The Sierra Club went on to accept $25 million in donation in 2007 from the gas industry to promote natural gas as a bridge fuel to renewable energy, and they wouldn't be lying because wind and solar farms work only about a third of the time, and the gap is most easily filled by gas. The biggest blow to nuclear power came from the Shoreham protests, which were supported by a full-page ad from the Oil Heat Institute. These protests succeeded in closing down a newly completed nuclear power plant. Wilco took a $6 billion beating, which basically chased away most private investors for good. And they were right. Accidents happen in every large industry. But if an accident at 3 Mile Island, which caused 0 casualties, could cause Shoreham to close, then yes, nukes weren't safe. For investors, that is. What followed was the loss of supply chains and expertise that has ended up making nuclear plant construction the equivalent of building a Lamborghini by hand in your backyard. In the meanwhile, Asia has been taking the lead, with construction times varying between 3 to 5.5 years. The fact of the matter is that the fossil fuel industry has a long history of funding anti-nukers along with climate deniers to protect their bottom line. Which is quite unfortunate because the news on climate always seems to be looking worse than expected, and that's not just my personal opinion. I hope we could agree that decarbonization is an imperative. According to the U.S. Department of Energy, nuclear power currently provides over half the clean electricity in the United States. When people argue that renewables should replace those plants, what they're really saying is that instead of moving forward, let's create a giant hole in the existing clean energy supply and play catch up. I might add that all this is based on an unsubstantiated assumption that we could replace the most dense power source in existence with sources of power with the least energy density, and that ripping down perfectly good nuclear plants would be better economically and environmentally. That's a tall order. Makes no sense to accept the call of the IPCC for decarbonization within the next 12 years, and yet reject their conclusion that these goals are impossible without nuclear power. The IPCC's team of 91 scientists came up with 90 different mixes of solutions that would keep warming limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius, but none of them work without atomic energy. The German experience proves it, with 2 decades and over €500 billion lost in the pursuit of 100% renewable energy. The result was the Germans have ended up leading the EU in deaths from coal pollution and the cost of electricity as well. In the meanwhile, France decarbonized 75% of its grid in less time with nuclear power, and they also produce cheaper electricity than their neighboring countries. And Germany is not the only nation that has problems with 100% renewables. Texas power prices jumped from less than $15,000 to as much as $9,000 a megawatt hour as coal plant retirements and weak winds left the region on the brink of blackouts during a heat wave. In Australia, regulators took 4 wind farm operators to court, alleging that their facilities contributed to a massive 2016 blackout. The incident has sparked a debate over whether Australia should even allow the grid to become so dependent on nuclear power. And solving this problem with battery backups is simply a non-starter. The annual output of the world's largest battery backup factory would require 1,000 years of production to make enough batteries for 2 days of U.S. energy supply for electricity. And while hydro as a backup is more effective, it isn't that much better. Hydroelectric dams are not only damaging to ecosystems, but they also produce nitrous oxide along with 1 billion tons of methane a year. That's why the Sierra Club has once loudly and rightfully called for the shutting down of dams instead of nuclear. It's not for nothing that their motto was once atoms, not dams. And dams that are the backbone of renewable energy are also the most dangerous source of energy as well. Almost 1,700 dams across the United States are at risk. And that old Sierra Club slogan is no less true today. 8,785 new hydropower dams are planned in Europe alone. More than a quarter of these hydropower projects are situated in protected areas, mainly in national parks. The 2 worst energy accidents in history were the Banku Dam, China in 1975, which killed 171,000 people, and the Mechuchu Dam failure 4 years later in India killed 5,000 to 10,000 people. In comparison, nuclear power's worst accident produced roughly 43 casualties so far. The Chernobyl event was a textbook picture of the sort of hubris that used to exist around nuclear energy in the bad old days. Chernobyl had no containment vessel. It had an inherently unstable design. Safety mechanisms were deliberately turned off for a test ordered from Moscow, and evacuations and corrective actions were delayed for roughly 3 days because the closed society enabled the authorities to hide it. That delay ended up increasing sickness and death. It makes about as much sense to shut down nuclear power plants because of Chernobyl as it does to close down all airports because of the crash of the Hindenburg. And what about the damage to the environment, you might ask? Well, the area around Chernobyl was predicted to be a nuclear desert, but instead it has become an enormous nature preserve. Interestingly, the inhabitants who remained outlived the evacuees. Now, I know at this point there has to be some of you who just want to scream, "What about Fukushima?" The fact is that there were 0 recorded radiation casualties from Fukushima. So we need to ask ourselves, if Fukushima was such a massive, long-lasting health catastrophe, how is it that 4 years later, Japan broke its all-time record for longevity? In fact, Japan continues to remain a perennial world leader in longevity in spite of having experienced 2 atomic bombings and 3 nuclear meltdowns. The real culprit in the deaths at Fukushima was not nuclear power, but rather the hysteria around the radiation, whose roots are in the radiophobia that has been spread by the anti-nuclear movement. The fear of low-level radiation has no bearing in science. In fact, recent studies on the biological effects of radiation demonstrate that the absence of radiation is not good for organisms, and many scientists have concluded that low-level radiation very much mimics how vaccines work in strengthening our immune system. One study has found that low-dose radiation from the atomic bombings in Japan actually elongated the lifespans and reduced cancer mortality relative to non-irradiated individuals. You heard that right. The atomic bomb survivors lived longer. The fact of the matter is that radiation is ubiquitous. Natural radioactive elements, including uranium, plutonium, and potassium-40 that are constantly leaching to the Earth's surface, dwarf the radiation from all the nuclear accidents combined. The increase in ocean radiation from Fukushima is actually too tiny to be measured on a Geiger counter. So the fish off Japan are fine. And the Japanese are quite healthy too. But in the end, the critics may be proven right about increasing deaths. The halting of the country's nuclear reactors has led Japan to fire up at least 8 new coal power plants in the last 2 years alone, which has, and then it have an additional 36 more coal plants, which will be coming online in the next decade. So many of you might be asking, what about the nuclear waste? Well, to begin with, over 96% of the spent fuel is reusable to power advanced Gen 4 reactors for centuries. And there's great potential for extraction of many valuable elements from spent fuel as well. Platinum, palladium, rhodium, ruthenium, and many other valuable elements make these canisters a literal gold mine. Japan and India are already recovering rhodium and other precious metals from spent nuclear fuel as well. And the amount of radiation fatalities from handling these spent fuel canisters worldwide is, you guessed it, 0. Even the radioactive remains from spent nuclear fuel that are left behind are used in nuclear medicine. They also power space probes as well as robots for NASA and are even used for food irradiation. This process is 100% safe and protects us from foodborne illnesses. Did anyone ever notice how environmental organizations' narrative on the phony nuclear waste crisis says nothing about renewable waste? And it's a big problem. These waste gases from solar panel production are up to 23,000 times more potent than CO2 and can remain in the atmosphere for 10,000 years. These are some of the more toxic chemicals from solar which will never leave the environment. Silicon tetrachloride, gallium diselenide, cadmium telluride, and many other toxic materials. 74% of global solar production comes from China, which has had riots over solar pollution. And there's a lot of it. Solar panels produce 300 times more waste than nuclear. And even the short-term energy density of renewables has already been grossly overstated. It's been estimated that the transition to wind and solar power in the United States will require 5 to 20 times more land than previously thought. The ecological footprint of solar panel development could grow to more than 27,500 miles, roughly the area of South Carolina, if the U.S. were to adapt more ambitious climate goals. Renewable mandates, which were designed to incentivize clean energy expansion, have actually caused the opposite effect. These mandates, which exist in 29 states so far, require that utilities purchase a percentage of their electricity from qualified renewable sources. These ill-conceived energy plans force electrical grids to play a near impossible balancing act. What we might think of as benign solar or wind spills often leads to massive electric spikes and wild fluctuations that could cause electricity prices to go negative or shoot up astronomically. This has ended up driving nuclear power plants out of business simply because their profitability is dependent on them running full time, and they are physically incapable of turning on and off quickly to accommodate prioritization of renewables. The big winner is natural gas. In total, renewable energy has gotten 15 times the subsidies of nuclear power, thus making it even less competitive. The superior reliability of nuclear power plants is largely based on their construction, which enables them to withstand the polar vortex, which has frozen coal supplies, gas lines, and wind power solid, while burying solar panels under tons of snow. Nuclear power plants have withstood the worst natural disasters, including hurricanes, earthquakes, and even the Fukushima tsunami. Yes, surprisingly, there were nuclear power plants that survived the tsunami. The Yonagawa plant, which was even closer to the epicenter of the 9.0 earthquake than the Fukushima Daiichi plant, along with the Fukushima Daini plant, both survived this tragic event and were operational. Luckily, they were not dangerously exposed as a result of TEPCO's cutting corners on safety. And renewables are fragile in comparison. When Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, the nation's second largest solar farm lost a majority of its panels. So my talk would be incomplete if I failed to address the issue of nuclear proliferation. Over the 70 years that encompass the atomic age, no nuclear reactor has ever produced an atomic bomb. It is far easier for a nation to build facilities explicitly for that purpose. In fact, nuclear power is actually used to disincentivize proliferation. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty bars any nation that pursues an atomic weapon from receiving peaceful nuclear technology. No better illustration of this can be made than the two Koreas. And you can see the difference. India's civilian nuclear program is hampered by their pursuit of atomic weapons as well. Not only that, but the megatons to megawatts program under the U.S. disarmament treaty with Russia ended up turning 20,000 atomic bombs into peaceful nuclear energy. For the past 2 decades, 10% of all the electricity consumed in the United States has come from Russian nuclear warheads. Furthermore, advanced molten salt, Gen 4 molten salt reactors, which should come online in the future decades, will use up spent nuclear fuel so completely as to leave nothing fissionable behind, and they are capable of turning existing stockpiles of plutonium into fuel as well, thus making these materials unavailable for use for nuclear weapons. In the final analysis, the real risk from nuclear power is that will not be used to the fullest, and that gambling our future on failed alternatives will ultimately lead us into the chaos of a hothouse Earth that could lead to a nuclear war. So there are 2 roads that the atom could take us, to peace and prosperity or oblivion and war. What path we choose, we have yet to see, But in the end, the most dangerous enemy we face is our own fear. Madame Curie put it right. Nothing in life is to be more feared, only to be understood. Thank you.